I don't know, I've given several cemetery tours. I've never given a church tour, but I've never given a cemetery tour where we're not at the cemetery. So we'll see how this goes. But just to finish talking about the railing and the carving here, the church burned in '85, and it was decided that to hire the Petersen brothers, myself and my two older brothers, Pam's husband Roger, and my brother Ronnie, to build the new church, and built this. And as we were getting close to finishing this project, in January of that year, I proposed to my wife Maggie. She accepted. We set a June 27th wedding date. We actually picked July 13th, but the guy that was best man had already, then he came out and decided to get married that day, so we moved it back to June 27th, which pushed 2 weeks onto the construction of this. And this altar rail was put down on Thursday and Friday, the day before our Saturday wedding. So if you want to know when this was, the date of this altar rail, I can tell you without a doubt, it was June 26th, 1987, that it was finished. So they were putting that. So we were when we got married, that was the first event in this church. And they had the first service the day after we were married. So, but enough about me and the church anyway. So I've been the sexton at the West Denmark Cemeteries for about 10 years now, 8 years, I guess. It'll be 9 pretty soon. But I've been on the cemetery board since I was in my 20s, which doesn't amount to too much work, but maybe one meeting a year, and occasional a problem comes up and the sexton doesn't want to make the decision himself, then we'd have a question there. But anyway, I took over the mowing of the cemetery when I retired in 2020, and when I did that, I got to know the cemetery a lot better, and because of that, as I was mowing the cemetery, I would think about people and things that were buried there, or things about the cemetery and people that were buried there. And ended up writing an article for this Church and Life magazine, which is just a publication from the Danish American Interest Conference. And they were kind enough to publish that, and since I had that published, I've had a lot of people ask me questions about the cemetery, but I'm happy to talk about it. But I'm a lot of, when I give a tour, it's some of the same stuff, but I'll touch on a little history of that. And I don't know, some of this you may have gotten already, but the first Danes came here in 1869 to settle, and there was M.C. Petersen was the original kind of founder of West Denmark here, and he had been here in 1868, came back and had bought some land or discovered land was quite cheap here, had four friends that came up, or one brother and some friends that came up in 1869. So, but the cemetery was established in 1873, and it's, most of you probably know, it's just out to the County Road end here, and then a quarter mile or so to the west. And a man by the name of Jensi Poulsen, P-O-U, which is the Danish spelling of Paul, he donated 2 acres of land out there for the cemetery with the idea that the church would also be built there. But at some point, after 1873, they decided to, the consensus was to build the church over here on this site overlooking the lake. And I think the process of building the church started in 1898. And that was, it was finished, I believe, in 1900, and for services at that point. The first burial at West Denmark, the cemetery, I believe was shortly after that. There's one stone over there that's a marble stone that they tend to wear a lot more than a granite stone. and it's kind of hard to read, but it does say 1874 on there. And so I think that was the first burial. It was a Billy, Creston Billy was his name. And for those of you who know the history of the church here a little bit, at some point the Danes here, like any other group, didn't get along as well as they should, and St. Peter's split off from West Denmark, and most of the Billy family ended up at St. Peter's. So there's a couple of graves from the Billy family in West Denmark, but that was before the split. The split wasn't so dramatic that they dug anybody up and moved them up to St. Peter's, I don't think, but anyway. And there's also a couple of, there's a mention of children that had died before that. The first baby born in West Denmark to the Danish people here had died shortly after childbirth. And there's a good chance that there may have been other children buried there before that, even as soon as the cemetery opened. But as far as the stone, the one from 1874 is the earliest. There's, when I do a cemetery tour, I always like to point out West Denmark has 2 Civil War veterans buried there. And one of them is Hans Christensen, who I don't know if he has any descendants in the area, but somewhere in old photos or archives here, I've seen a picture of him, and from the 1920s, or 19-teens maybe, but he's got a long white beard, he's got a white shirt and tie, and he just looks exactly like you expect a Civil War veteran to look like in a picture from late in life. And he actually was one of the first 4 settlers. He was from Nina, and a lot of Danes down there too. And he was in the Battle of Chattanooga, Tennessee, and with the 3rd Wisconsin Infantry. And the only reason I know that was because I did a tour for a family reunion on Saturday, and we were at his grave, and I remember seeing the 3rd Wisconsin Infantry. And when he got back to Nina, he married the widow of a friend of his that had been killed in action down in Chattanooga there. And they came up here then as one of the first settlers. And the other Civil War veteran that we have there is William Foster. And William Foster is the founder of the town of Luck. He had a trading post over there well before the Civil War, run by him, and his father then was at some point involved with that, although William Foster left to join the Wisconsin Cavalry Union in 1861 and was gone for 5 years. And I think that's possibly when his father came. William Foster was originally from Maine. I think that's when his father came to help, although I'm not sure about that exactly when the father was here. But anyway, William Foster was gone for 5 years, and apparently they kept the store open somehow. So my guess is that he had his father doing that. William Foster then came back to the town of Luck, and some people credit him with saying that he had a tough time during the war and he wanted to be in Luck the rest of his life, and so named the town of Luck the other, and I'm sure many of you have heard this or know this, but the other theory proposed is that Luck was kind of his trading post was the halfway point between St. Croix Falls and the logging camps up by Clam Falls. And if you had a real good day, you could be to that post, spend the night there, so if you made it that far, you were in luck to be there. And I don't know which one of those two is true, but neither one of them really makes much, it has a big connection to the cemetery here, but I thought I'd throw that in anyway. William Foster is buried in West Denmark, probably because he had been married to a Native American woman who died in childbirth, and were both buried near his post over there by the school, which was over by the Luck School. at some point after the Danes had moved in here, William Foster asked the blacksmith out here, Soren Petersen, with a D, Soren Pedersen, whether he knew of a Danish woman that would be willing to come over here and be his wife. And he was able to find somebody that came over. Her name was Marie. She did not know, she spoke no Danish, or she spoke no English, he spoke no Danish, but they got married a short time later, and as Edwin said in his book, got along well enough to have 8 children together anyway. And eventually, of course, but he died well before she did, and so I suspect that she had him buried out here at West Denmark. And I wonder if she had died first, he maybe would have had her buried there, and both would have been over in luck. Throw in another story is that William Foster apparently came out to one of the early 4th of July celebrations out here at West Denmark, and they had a Danish flag up on the flagpole and no American flag. And William Foster told them that they needed to get a flag that was an American flag, and apparently they kind of hemmed and hawed whether they needed to do that. And he threatened to go home and get his gun and shoot the flagpole down if they didn't find an American flag to put up there. And at some point they did at least find a small American flag, apparently. So, but he is buried there, and I mentioned his father, and his father is also buried there. His name was Daniel Foster. And I've written this down because it was in the cemetery book. His father Daniel was born in 1787 and died in 1874. And in the cemetery book, he is listed as a veteran. And if he was born in 1787, that would make him roughly 25 years old at the time of the War of 1812. So I wonder if he is an 1812 veteran or possibly from the Indian Wars or whatever. But almost 2 years ago now, I called the County Veterans Administration here, and they promised they would look into it, but they said there was a terrible backlog, and that it would probably take more than a year to get information on him. And I had his birth date and death date, but I didn't know other than he was probably came from Maine. And I called this summer before our 150th here, just hoping that maybe they knew a little more, but they said, no, it's even further back. It might be another year from now before you get information on this. But
So now if you could find somebody that was in the Polk County Genealogy Society, I bet you they could look it up for you.
I'm hoping that's why I brought this information with here today, that somebody, if you're real interested, maybe you can find something before the VA gets around to it. But when I called about it, they said, oh yeah, no, I see your name is on here yet as a request, and it's in the works to try to find some information. But the other thing about that is I suspect, because he would have been one of the first burials, I think there's a good chance he maybe was buried over at the trading post there and then moved here at a later date, but I don't know for sure. I suspect it might have been after the son William died. And there's also a couple of their sons that died relatively young, one of whom was probably a Spanish-American War veteran. He was about that age, but died as a young man of 23 or 24 of tuberculosis. They said he was a big, strong, just a bull of a man, but in a matter of a few years, the tuberculosis had taken him down. But that's the 2 Civil War veterans. One of the other early settlers here, let me see if I can find this here. Not the early settlers, but we have there's a Marius Petersen that's buried here. A lot of Petersens in the cemetery. And the town of Luck had 2 Marius Petersens. And of course, you had to keep them straight. One of them was a cement mason, so they called him Cement Marius. And the other one was the West Hotel in Luck, and he's Hotel Marius. And for a long time, I wasn't sure which one of the 2 Marius Petersens we had here in West Denmark, but I've since been informed that Hotel Marius is actually buried at St. Peter's Cemetery. So I've been, now I can say with some confidence that this is Cement Marius that was buried here in the late 60s. So that's another one of those that's a little bit interesting as far as the personal history of what's going on here. One of the stones I always point out when we do a tour is a woman by the name of Edith Larson. I did not know her at all. She didn't live around here, but she was buried in 1997, so relatively recently. And when I was mowing one time, my daughter came down to look at something, and we were walking around the set. She was walking around the cemetery, and she said, "Dad, what's with this inscription at the bottom of this stone over here?" And I went over to look at that, and it's a nice little stone set in the ground. And on the bottom of that stone, it says, carved in there, "My name is not Fred." And we looked at that, and my daughter Britta said, I bet her husband was named Fred, and she didn't want to be Mrs. Fred Larson. And I thought, well, that's a little odd. But Kathy Wilson did a little research for me and said, yes, she was married to Fred Larson, but he's not buried there. So I suspect that they were divorced. I don't know this for sure. And at some point had been called Mrs. Fred Larson, and since they were divorced, she didn't like that. And so for all eternity, she's got, "My name is not Fred" on the stone there. After I told this story a few times, then one of my friends said, who was living in Ellsworth for a while, said they had an older lady that was their neighbor, and her nickname was Fred, and she didn't like it, but her brothers called her that just to irritate her, and so, which could sound like some brothers or whatever. So I suppose that's another option that why this "My name is not Fred" is on there. But like I say, I know the family, several of the family that's buried there. It's like her maiden name was Larson with an E-N, and the married name was Larson with an O-N, and that's probably the case, one of those two, I would guess anyway. But I mentioned the town of Luck, and William Foster being the founder, and M.C. Petersen being our founder here at West Denmark. And M.C. died in 1917, so I don't have, obviously, any personal connection to him or personal remembrance of him, but when I was writing this article, I got to thinking about something that M.C. and his wife had 10 children, and for whatever reason, all the boys had two middle initials, or two middle names. So on the cemetery, and several of them are buried in West Denmark here, and the names are all there. But one of his youngest sons was Paul A.O. Petersen. I don't know what the A.O. stood for, but that was the middle initials. Well, in about 1962 or something, I was a kid, 5 years old. I was at an event at the hall up there, and this Paul Petersen was there. It was P-E-D, spelled that way. But somebody thought they should take a picture of old Paul Petersen and young Paul Petersen. So I've got this photo here of me sitting beside Paul A.O. Petersen, who was M.C. Petersen's son, who died just a year or two after this photo was taken here. So that's my connection to M.C. Petersen, the founder of West Denmark here. So we'll put this out. I brought a couple other things here. Oh, one other thing I mention quite often when I go on the tour here is that not too far from the Hans Christensen's grave is a grave of George Schlagenhoff, and next to him, just kitty corner, is Kama Grumstrup, and both of them are over 100 years old when they died. And there's only two others in the cemetery that are over 100. One was Eva Hansen, who was Norman Paul Hansen's mother, and the other one is Kama's son, Erling Grumstrup, who was the one that put the ship together that's up hanging up there. So, especially when I'm doing the confirmation class, a tour, I say you look at all these graves here. Everybody would like to be in good shape and live to be 100, but there's only 4 in this whole cemetery that made it that far. So your chances are not real good. But I was going somewhere with that.
George asking his mother.
What's that?
George asking his mother if he could get married.
Oh, yeah, thank you. Yeah. And so George, that was the genetics of Erling and his mother being there, is that George, his first wife died relatively young, but George remarried to Solveig Jensen from church here late in life. In fact, George was 86 when he got married, and he could still ask his mother for permission to get married because she was still alive and lived to be 106. So, so the genetics was there for some long life. Thank you, Pam. I also quite often, there's a couple of, when I do the tour, history-wise, we have, of course, many veterans there, including a lot of World War II veterans. And we have, there's three veterans that were on Iwo Jima. Harlan Scholl was one who I did not know very well, and then the other 2 were Wally Johansson and Erling Grumstrup. And Wally Johansson and Erling knew each other. Erling was married to Wally's cousin Selma, and they managed to meet up on the island of Iwo Jima while the fighting was still going on. And one of them had gotten some Danish rye bread and raspberry jam from home, and they basically sat in a foxhole and shared this raspberry jam and rye bread. Erling was wounded and evacuated from there. Wally was there till the end of the fighting. Wally was in the Seabees, and one of his tasks was they were working on the airport, and Wally was in a dozer doing some of that, and he said that occasionally the Japanese that were up in the hills overlooking them would fire at him. Occasionally he'd hear bullets ricocheting off the bulldozer while he was working, but he said they were a long ways off and weren't likely to hit him, so he didn't worry too much about it. But and a couple other guys, Gene Jensen was landed on D-Day. He was a lawyer up in Grantsburg for many years, and then Drain Paulson, who was our mailman for many years, was in the Battle of the Bulge, right where the Germans broke through and was captured and spent the rest of the war as a POW. So, I don't know that I have, like I say, it's a little bit hard to do this cemetery tour without being up there. So I hope, I don't know if they would have any questions, probably not. I brought a couple of things with. I don't have a lot of old cemetery records, but a few of them, but most of them are Danish, the earliest ones. But I actually have the original from 1876, where they had set out the decision to sell, how to sell lots for the cemetery. And at some point, somebody has typed it up in English here. And so it's just, the trustees met in the schoolhouse by the Little Nut Lake in order to undertake the decision to sell lots on the cemetery's land. And I don't think, oh yeah, there it is right there. The lots that are open, you could get a cemetery plot for $2. And this was in 1878. And it seems to be that on here somewhere on the Danish it says $4, and I don't see anything on $4 here, so that maybe was a whole plot of 4. I'm not sure what, but and the other thing I brought with and it's not really anything of great note, but this is Mrs. Marie Foster, and that's the widow of William Foster, founder of the town of Luck. And it's her bank book from the Luck Bank, and there's a little note in here saying that she is paying from her estate for perpetual care at the cemetery, which was they had a perpetual care fund to take care of it. But as I went through this, and these are from 1910 to 1916, I think here, or something like that. 1921, I guess is the last one. She had been widowed, but she had several sons, and I assume, as the founder of the town, like, you might want to think he was well off. But at one point, there's $400 in here, and I assume that was a pretty good sum of money, but that's the extent of it. And by the time we're down to the end here, the last several years, it was well under $100 for her savings account. So I don't know if she had trouble scraping by or not on that, but anyway, I still have this from Mrs. Marie Foster. And another thing that I found interesting was a congregational meeting from 1881. And it has the descriptions of the fence that has to be put around the cemetery that they were going to build. And you like to think that in the old days they just would have said we need a fence or whatever, and did that. But I'll just it's one paragraph here. But the fence shall be of boards, 4 boards high, with a water board on top. The post shall be of good oak wood, 7 feet, in the 1970s. And this is just the plot here, and or the map, and it had the cemetery board on there, and I finished. I started this talking about Edwin Petersen, and finishing it by pointing out that Edwin was also on the cemetery board. His name's right here on this, so Edwin was an important part of this church here. So that's really all I have to say about the cemetery. I would have done a little bit more up there, but I probably bored you enough with the cemetery already here. So. Any questions?
Did they sell family plots, and how many were in that? Or
Yes.
individuals?
Yeah, they're still, they're set up in plots of 4. And I'm thinking about it now, one other thing that made me think of this too is that, most of you are aware any of these older cemeteries, how many children are buried there. And in the cemetery book, one after the other, small child of so-and-so or whatever. But there's one plot where it's the 3 children of A.N. Hansen, and I don't know, from 1898, where they had a 5-year-old, a 6-year-old, and a 10-year-old that all died in 1898, and then a baby a couple years later. And I don't know, I really should check into it, check the death records and see if it was, I suppose it could have been a fire, but I assume it was probably a disease. But to imagine losing 3 children like that, and actually not very far from that, there's another one where it's 4 children of the same family. And those 4, they don't have individual markers. It just says, children of Mickelkirk. And as you go around the cemetery, you see many of those. But like I say, that one I always say is the saddest spot in the cemetery. 3 children that are that age.
So is this a church cemetery or a non-church cemetery?
It is technically a non-church cemetery.
Was it always that way?
I don't know. That's a good question. If I look at the original there, let's see if it, well, yeah, I don't know. It does say trustees of the cemetery, and they met in school, and you would say, well, that's because they didn't want to be in the church, but the church wasn't built yet, so they couldn't meet in the church at that point. So, yeah.
So since I'm also a cemetery sexton, I gotta have some, what do you sell a grave for? Do you allow more than one burial in a grave?
You mean right now? What
Yeah,
I
right
have
now.
for? Well, as I was just saying before, and at this point they're $300 a plot, but we are going to raise them probably to $500. So if you want one quick, it's not a hard sell here, but they are going.
And you don't have to be a member of the church or anything?
No. And we allow two cremations in one plot. It's got to be one stone, unless the second stone is completely flat in the ground. So, then I had to give a cemetery tour for a family reunion on Saturday, and an aunt of mine, her husband died at a young age in the 1930s, and she moved to California and lived the rest of her life out there. And they had put a stone for her husband, and she had a stone with her birth date on there. And then when she died, much later, 50 years later, she decided to be buried out in California, and so it says interred in Solvang, California on the stone. And it never struck me until not too long ago that normally when you have a husband and wife, the stones are right together. Well, they had a plot for 4, and those stones are about as far apart as they could be in that plot. And this was very recently, I just found out that he died, he had seizures, and that's what he died during a seizure as a relatively young man. And they said, my sister told me that apparently he did not treat her very well. He was not very nice to her. And so I'm wondering if that's why she had the stone put as far away from him as possible in that plot, or if that was just coincidence. But either way, she decided to be buried out in California and not with him. So I guess I don't know that I'll be offending anybody by saying he was mean to her in the 1930s. Rush at Wolf Creek.
Yeah, $350.
Okay.
A great 5 by 10, and that's probably going to be good for another year. So if you don't want to do the $500.
Yeah, well, with me and the cemetery board, it moves pretty slow, so we'll see how quickly it's happening.
Financially, I take it that you're raising the price because you think you need more money to take care of it, or?
Well, financially, we are pretty good right now. Although some of that came from somebody from Toronto with connections here at West Denmark. His aunt was going to be buried here, changed her mind, gave him the plot that she had, and so he said, well, I'll donate to the cemetery what it would cost us for a plot in Toronto. And actually, Nikki, I told you it was $2,500. We got a check for $5,000 from him because that was the price of 2 plots in Toronto. So that was a pretty nice gift. And
would that be a warning? Don't die in.
So now I'll give you if you were in the town of Laketown, a cemetery over here, or if you're in the town of Eureka or in Sterling, you would get $1,000 a year from the local town board to keep you running the cemetery.
Yes.
So that, whereas if you were in Bone Lake, the cemetery at the church there is run by the township, and they're just getting ready to take over the one up north at that church.
oh,
So and I asked them about $1,000 a year, and they said, oh, that would be a very good price to keep people running. So
Sure.
we asked for it at the Wolf Creek one too,
Yeah.
and they just said sure, because we prefer your volunteer yeah, you know, your own board running it rather than the township running
Yeah.
it, so you could ask.
Yeah, no, it has been brought up to us that some of the cemeteries could help from the.
Yeah, well,
township.
and we don't necessarily, shouldn't say this, we don't necessarily need it, but we felt like that was something that would
Sure.
help us, because mowing is our most expensive part
You
for
know,
ours.
you see that, at the moment, I'm mowing cemeteries volunteer, so,
Yeah, and ours costs us like about $300 each time we mow it.
yeah,
So-
so, at some point here, I won't want to do that, and, we may have to shift, to that, but it probably a good idea that we look into that. I actually just stopped at the, Bull Lake Cemetery. I knew there was the, town board that had that, because I was reading about their artificial flowers there. That was the thing that they had there, so,
Just a week ago, this weekend, last Monday, I made a connection with somebody from California, Sobey, who wanted to come and know her family, like who she was related to, and find out more about her grandmother, who she never knew, which was Island and Ellen Sorensen, but Ellen was a Pedersen. So like I'm talking to Paul, and he's like, oh yeah, they're there, and they're there. So like he didn't even go out with us, he just said where they were, and we found what we were looking for.
one advantage of Morgan Cemetery, you get to know the people there because,
But it was pretty fun because Dean and Eddie went with us, Dean Johansson
oh,
and
okay.
Eddie. So they were related to some of the same people that she was related to. And then the MC Petersen connection was Dina,
Oh,
was MC's daughter,
yeah,
who married Axel Benson.
oh, okay,
So that was her great-grandparents.
oh, okay.
So it was like kind of fun to do that family history with her
You
and
know-
find out about it myself too.
After talking to you, Barb, I was looking, and I think Ivan Swenson might have been confirmed here at West Denmark.
Yes, we met with Mary Jensen and she found his pictures.
Okay, like I said, I know that my dad knew him and was
Yeah.
friends with him, but I wasn't
Great.
positive he was from here, so,
Yeah.
but I'm pretty sure that was him I
Yeah, so
saw.
the last time she came was in 2020. She knew nobody, she didn't know like who to make a connection with. Everything was kind of closed up. So this time she made connection with the History Museum, and they actually gave her tons of papers of who she was related to and the property. And so Dean actually took her out to the Benson farm where the foundation still
No,
was.
sure.
So that was pretty fun.
Yeah, if you get family history queries, the Genealogy Society, there's a volunteer, Laura Jensen, who does
She
a
was
lot
the
of,
one who did
yeah,
all that research.
that does a
on it.
lot of lookups for,
Yeah.
and then we also pass it to Kathy Wilson sometimes, because she has a copy of all of your records here too.
Yeah, well, Kathy's helped me with a
Yeah.
couple of things there,
Uh,
so.
Something like 2008 or 9 or somewhere, Chuck Edelman and I went down in the basement and they gave us all of the records and we photographed every page of everything that was there.
Sure.
So we have a copy in the museum on the computer.
Okay. It's good to know.
Yeah, Laura was very helpful.
Anything else?
How long does it take you to mow the cemetery?
Well, it's hard to believe it was one of our driest summers for a long time, but this summer, I mowed it less than I have in the 4 years I've been mowing, which was nice. But it's, if I get started by about 10 o'clock, I can go home for lunch and be done by about 5 or something like that. So it pretty well shoots a day. And in a wet year, or some years it's got to be around Memorial Day. It's almost every week. But this year, through much of August and September, there was parts I really didn't even mow because it just the grass was growing so slowly. But
What kind of soil is underneath?
well, on the east side, they did a bunch of landscaping. They kind of flattened the hill out, and the soil was terrible. And it's real hard to dig up there. But the other part, much of the other part is pretty decent soil, fairly easy to dig.
So do you have hand dug graves for full burials?
No,
You have somebody come in and?
yeah, no. And that's, I mean, that's the family that arranges that, they just give them the names. I wouldn't say it hasn't been done, but I don't know, I don't remember any that were hand dug.
So, who do you have do the digging?
Prolong quite often.
Oh, okay. Yeah, at Wolf Creek, it's sand, and we try to have everything hand dug. There's a guy over by, well, our hand digger, Rick Davis there just died, but there's another guy, Scott Hasselquist, that does hand digging. It disturbs the cemetery a whole lot less than those machines.
No, that's interesting.
Yeah.
This past winter, I had a request for a full burial in February, and I wish I would have said no. I almost said no at the time. I mean, normally it can't be done, but there was no frost in the ground this winter because of all the snow, and I had a hard time finding exactly where it had to go, and they did what they could, but they still made an awful mess when all the snow melted and everything. So I think in the future I'll just say it has to wait till spring.
So do you have your 4 grave lots marked with some kind of corners or something?
Some of them are, or quite a few of them are, although they're hit and miss whether you can find those cement markers there.
And are they reasonably accurate?
I hope so.
Yeah.
And I shouldn't say this in front of a group, but my great fear is that I'll mark a cemetery plot to be dug, and they'll call me and say, we've hit stuff down there that doesn't, there's somebody already down there, but I haven't had that happen yet anyway. So,
That happens,
yeah.
but,
In my article, I mentioned there's one grave that it says in the book a guy was buried coincidentally in February of 1925 or 1928, and I cannot find any sign of a stone or marker there. And I've looked a couple of times. I know my son has done a little bit of work with the county with some ground scanning stuff, and I asked him if he could maybe sneak that home some night and we'll look for something. But
the Alden Township has a big cemetery, and they hired for $10,000 it's not a big cemetery like maybe yours, it's not as big as yours, but to have the ground penetrating radar do the whole cemetery. And that showed, because there were a lot of unmarked graves, it's an older one, and they said that showed pretty good where people were,
Sure.
so they knew what they could use or shouldn't use, but it didn't tell, of course, who was in there.
Yeah. To let people dig their own for the cremations.
We generally try to do it ourselves, but if someone says they want to do it, we mark exactly where we want to have it and tell them, and maybe someone supervises. We don't charge for locating graves, or some cemeteries say everything that you have done, you get a charge for, like finding where to put the grave in, or doing that, and we just include that as part of our cost of what it is. But digging the grave is actually, they pay the funeral home, which then pays the grave digger. We don't get involved in that part of it.
Yeah, that's it for a full grave. I've had a couple of high school kids that if they don't want to dig it themselves, that I hire them to try to make it pretty profitable for them, so they don't have to twist their arm to do it.
I think we charge $80 for a cremation hole.
And we're 75.
75.
In much of the cemetery, they can do that in half an hour.
Sure, yeah.
But no problem. But up on the new part where I mentioned they did that landscaping, it can be kind of tough there, but I'm sure it still doesn't take them 2 hours to do it, but it can be kind of tough to get a hole there, so. But anyway, they're generally happy to do it. So.
Do you have a lot of room left?
Yeah, fair amount. We have the very east part of the cemetery is undeveloped at this point. We don't have it plotted out yet. And we actually, just a couple of years ago, decided to, we were mowing it occasionally, we decided to do a pollinator plot up there, so we've got prairie plants planted there, and this is just the second year, and it's responding pretty well. But the idea, and it was somebody on the cemetery board that suggested it, is people they know cemeteries where people have their ashes spread, just like on the pollinator plot, and then they have some sort of a plaque where you could have names of people whose ashes were buried there if they want some sort of remembrance. And we haven't gotten it very far yet. We're just starting, like I say, got the pollinator.
There's these trends, like right now, we've had a few requests, can we do a green burial? Which essentially, as I understand it, is you don't do an embalming, you don't do any preparation of the body really with chemicals, and you put them in a shroud, and then you just bury them, but not in a box or something like that in the ground, or maybe a wooden box. But we don't like a wooden box in the cemetery without a concrete vault, because they all collapse eventually, and then you have to fill in again afterwards. If you see an old cemetery, you see the dips where people are buried. And so that's why most cemeteries say a vault is required if you're gonna do a full burial. Plus, so that wild animals didn't dig them up, and, and diseases didn't come out and that, but,
Well, we should probably just talk cemetery amongst ourselves.
Yes.
We,
well, these folks are all, of the genealogy folks, we spend a lot of time in cemeteries because we're looking for our ancestors' graves and things, so we're pretty familiar with cemeteries.
We actually had a burial at West Denmark a couple of years ago, a guy from the area, but I didn't know him at all, but his mother had died and he contacted me before she died, but he wanted a full burial, but no vault, and wanted to know if that was legal at West Denmark, and I told him as far as I knew it was, and one of the guys had checked into statewide regulations, because I said, geez, I don't know anything about it, and but so his mother was buried without a vault, but it was not a wood casket, but I don't know exactly if that was just to save money or what, but he did not want a vault anyway. So.
Yes, if you're a genealogy person, you should volunteer to be on the cemetery board, because you learn about the whole business side of the cemetery, along with just going there to find your relatives. It's really quite fascinating. And then these old records, like you have, and that quite often we have to look up people in our cemetery, and not only are they there, where are they, when were they buried, or what can you find out, but also ours had sold 8 grave lots, and are there any left in our family lot?
Yeah.
Are there 5 buried and 3 left, so we don't have to buy a new grave, because we tell them, okay, if they're already purchased at $10 for 8 graves 50 years ago, it's still good.
Well, they had, a couple of years ago, I had something happen that was kind of odd here too, that I was down there mowing or working or whatever, and then walking by, and all of a sudden, there's a new gravestone there that, of a burial that they had never contacted me. They just put a cremation burial there and had a headstone put in there. And it was in the family plot, but it was technically a full plot already, but it was after the fact done when I finally talked to the family, who was actually a distant relative, but hopefully that doesn't happen too often, where they put a stone in without even contacting me.
Yeah. How many people do you think are buried in the cemetery? Do you have like even an idea?
I don't. Somebody else asked me that one time, and I just don't know.
I usually estimate by saying, okay, there are 300 8-grave plots, of which probably most of those 8-grave plots have at least 5 people or something like that, so I multiply it out.
Well, if it keeps raining like this for days on end, I'll sit and go through try to figure it out a little bit there, so I can answer that sometime. But anyway, I've talked enough. So,
You can get a chance to get the Church of Life that he wrote in, it's the best article.
I saw that, yeah.
I think
yeah.
for, there is a website that I think you can look at past issues, except they were having some kind of trouble with it recently, but I don't know if that's been